Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Rhinebeck Historical Society's monthly meeting. Tonight, Don McTiernan and I have a very special show for you. 2 years ago, the Chancellor Livingston chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution donated hundreds of items to the archives. Books, prints, maps, letters, deeds, and photographs. And I wanted to show you the collection. It's all been scanned. I spent last summer and fall scanning most of the collection. It's now up on the web thanks to Steve Hubbard, our technical support person. I'm going to show you at the end how to access it. But what we want to do tonight, we thought we'd start with 30 properties in the village of Rhinebeck and start with a that, then, and now. So we can show you what they looked like 100 years ago. They were taken by, what's the gentleman's name? Coutant was the name of the photographer, around 1915 to 1918, Michael said. And we're going to show you what they look like today. And some of them are the same, some of them are gone. So it's quite an adventure through time. And then I'll show you a few of the prints, the photographs, the deeds, to show you what else is in the collection. We have like 80 slides to get through, so we can hold the questions till the end. That would be great. But if you have something you want to know as we're passing a house, please let me know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the house and the people that lived in, and I want to thank Nancy Kelly for her help telling us who all these people were. And Dawn is an expert on architecture, and we're going to talk a little bit about the architecture of the buildings as we pass through them. So this is a map from 1876 of the village of Rhinebeck. And we're going to take you on a walk starting around Market Street, heading up South Street, down to Route 9, and back up Market Street and Livingston Street to show you some of the houses. And this is a great old map that we have in the collection. It's not part of the DAR collection, but it's in the collection. It is up on the web as part of the Teal Map collection. And it shows you what life was like, what the stores were in existence 150 so years ago. So let's start with the first property. This is the Bowery House Tavern. And the Bowery House Tavern was owned by Peter Pultz, who lived across the street at 97 East Market Street when it was built in 1795. And then he moved into my house at 93 East Market Street in 1836. And this was his tavern, and it was beginning to fall apart at this point. And about 50 years ago, it was torn down. And today's picture of the tavern is.
You can see it was reminiscent of the Elmendorf Inn that still survives in Red Hook.
Do you know who lived in that little house next door?
No, I don't.
Annie Rosengrantz.
Okay.
And her father was had the Rosengrantz Hardware.
That was. I'm going to show a picture of that in a few minutes. The hardware store. So today, this is a modern house built about 40 or 50 years ago, and the tavern is gone. So this is one of the properties that we've lost. We move up the block to the next slide.
I think Isabel was actually here tonight.
Yes, she is. And this is at the corner of Market and Parsonage Street, and it's called the Colton Potter Van Vliet House in the DAR. All these names are from the DAR collection. It was built by Asa Potter and renovated by Dr. Van Vliet and eventually bought by a gentleman named Colton. And
this is a Central Hall Georgian house, vernacular Georgian house, and it has a double arch stairway with keystones in the interior. Georgian houses were a real shift in house design beginning in this country about 1840. It became the prestige type of house to own. And it's no longer a vernacular house because you have a central hall and you can check out the people who enter the house. They don't enter the private rooms of the house immediately. They enter a hall, and so it's like a closed type of floor plan in this house. 5 bays across the front, 2 stories high, 2 rooms deep. That's the traditional Georgian house, and they're still with us today, Central Hall Colonials. But then, subtractively, you can have a 2/3 Georgian, which is only 3 bays. You can have a quarter Georgian, with a side stair. So it's, just keep that in mind because this was a architect designed type of house, and it became so influential on house design in this country from that point on, say beginning 1740, probably until 1840, for 100 years. It was the primary status type of house.
Before we move to the next slide, remember the shutters and that little entrance over the front porch. And if we go to the next slide today, this is 109 East Market Street. And it's been beautifully restored. The clappers have been put back, but the shutters are gone, and the porch is gone. Although Don said that Mr. Bakalidis, who owns it, is talking about coming to the planning board to ask for permission to put the little porch back on the front entrance. And
I think Dennis is here today, somewhere.
okay, and so next house across the street, this was Stephen McCarty's house. This was, he converted it from an old tavern into his home. Now, Stephen McCarty was the son of Daniel McCarty, who was a Revolutionary War soldier, wound up being the miller at the Beekman Mill on the east side of Route 9. And Stephen McCarty was a builder. He built the part of the Dutch Reformed Church. He built the Stone Church, possibly the Lutheran Church, and many houses, including mine, along Market Street and I believe Livingston Street. And if we go to the next slide, this is what it looks like today. Pretty much the same. It just had a brand new metal roof put on this year. And it still has the front entrance, so it's slightly changed. And those, I'll let Don talk about the architecture.
Again, it's a central hall Georgian house, full Georgian, 2 stories high, 5 bays, and 2 rooms deep. And you notice the first floor windows in the front facade are longer. Later on, you'll see other buildings with that type of window, those types of windows. So it's really a French influence, a later French influence. The French doors, you'll see, drive down through the village on Route 9, you'll see a lot of houses with the French windows, the casement windows on the first floor. Again, it was but that was later. That was probably post-Civil War when that was done.
So if we look at the next slide, this is the Reformed Church parsonage for the Reformed Church, which is 2 blocks down. And I asked Nancy Kelly, how come parsonage, which is usually right next to the church, is 2 blocks away? And Nancy reminded me that this whole section of the village was owned and still is owned by the Reformed Church. And so this was on their land, and a couple of blocks away, I guess wasn't so far, 200 years ago. So the parsonage, notice it's got 3 bays and a little extension on the left.
This is a 2/3 Georgian with a side hall, and it's 2 rooms deep. It's really a later Georgian house, probably built around the 1840s, and it has a basement kitchen on the creek side, the Landsman's Kill side. I have this theory that the church didn't want to build a full Georgian house for their minister. They wanted something that wasn't quite that ostentatious, so they decided to, this is just my theory, to do a 2/3 Georgian house with a side hall rather than a full Georgian house. And but this is a very deep house. If you go by it on Parsonage Street, you'll see it's as deep as it is wide in front. So it's pretty much a square plan.
We look at it today.
And it originally had 2 chimneys on this west end.
I guess part of the 3 bay long porch is gone, and so is the extension on the side. They took that off over time. But other than that, it looks pretty much the same as it did. Okay, now this was a mystery. The Seymour house, and I said, where's this house? Don and I walked up and down the street taking these pictures, and we couldn't find this house. We came across Peter Sipley, who was raking his front yard. I said, Peter, do you know this house? He goes, yes, it was my grandmother's house. I said, Where is it? He said, it's gone. You're looking at it. It's the parking lot of the Father Brogan Center. It was torn down. And it was the home of the Rhinebeck Academy. And so I said, well, how are we going to figure out if this was the house that was torn down? So if you look, remember that there's a front porch and a left side porch and an extension in the back. Okay, now if we go to the next slide, there was this company called Sanborn Insurance Company that went around drawing maps of the village in the I think we have like 1885, 1905. We have like every 5 to 10 years we have a series of maps. And I looked on the 1912 Sanborn map. Here was the high school that burned down. And here is a building across the street with a porch on the front and the left side and an extension in the back. And that would have been 27 South Street if it were still here. But it's gone. And here's the picture of it today. And Peter was right. It's the parking lot of the Father Brogan Center. One of the several houses you see they're going to be lost to us. Here is the Rhinebeck Reformed Church, as it was 100 years ago. And I think Dawn has some comments about that.
Yes, it's the Dutch Reformed Church. The east wall is stone. The entrance facade is brick, and the west side is brick. And I think the north end is stone also. Brick was very expensive and very difficult to transport when this was built in the early 1800s. And so the church fathers, I think, arrived at the decision that they would put their best foot forward with the building and have the sides that were most visible in brick, and then the rest of it in stone. But you can imagine even getting stone from the river, from barges on the river, and having to bring them up before the truck and tractor and either run by horses or ox teams, to get them up to the building site was pretty difficult, laborious, and took a lot of time. So, and stone was a lot less expensive than brick.
We also noticed this little piece up here.
It's a mixture, an eclectic mixture of Gothic revival and Italian revival. The round-headed windows on the entrance facade are Italian, and of course the pointed arch windows are Gothic design. And this little point up here is a pinnacle, also a Gothic touch. And there was one on the other side, I'm sure, also.
So if we look at today, it looks pretty much the same, except the tower's been rebuilt, and the little Gothic things are gone. And there also were some shutters on here, which seem to be gone as well. So shutters that were on there. But, and as I said, I believe that Stephen McCartys was one of its builders, and the graveyard, of course, contains 25 Revolutionary War soldiers. And there's a legend, I think in Nancy's book said there's a legend.
44.
44, okay. And there's a legend that Henry Beekman is buried under the church. That's what Nancy's book said, so there's a lot of legends. George Washington sleeping in the Beekman Arms, which is not true. Yes?
I don't see any power lines in these old pictures. Were these people still in the dark back then, 1915?
Well, electricity came to Rhinebeck in 1900 and slowly, moved through the town, but
Power lines are right there.
you
You can
sort
see
of
the power lines on the right,
Oh, yeah, there's one.
right here.
Yeah, there's the power line. So,
There weren't as many of them.
right, but the Rhinebeck Power Company started in 1900 down at Hogg's Bridge. So if we move to the next slide, which is the Red Hook Telephone Company. This is a beautiful building, and this building is the only thing that's left of it, Calico. And want to say something about it, or?
Well, again, it's a 5-bay Georgian facade with a central entry, probably in brick. And I can remember there was quite a controversy when they took this down and put up the new telephone building, which is now obsolete. Now they have a very small building behind the parking lot, just southeast of this, to replace this building. Of course, this building's been for rent for years, which is unfortunate because this is a really handsome
It is a beautiful building.
set of buildings.
And the only thing that's left is the Calico building, as you'll see in the next slide. So we just have the Calico, and we have this modern brick building we've lost. It's another building that we've lost. So a real sad building that we lost. Well, Beekman Arms first. There's a couple of slides of the Beekman Arms.
Beekman Arms?
Yeah, Beekman Arms. Here's one picture from the collection of the Beekman Arms. Of course, the greenhouse wasn't there. And but the Beekman Arms looks pretty much like it does today.
And here are those French doors that became very fashionable after the Civil War.
And the next is another
So
picture
this
of
would
the
be a 1918 photograph,
Yeah.
after the addition on the north, the south, rather was added.
Here's another picture of it, some gentleman coming out. But today, the next slide, it looks pretty much the same, except, for the greenhouse down here. And I believe, I've heard that the Banthers are interested in coming to the planning board to take out the greenhouse and expand the dining room, to have a larger ballroom, because only 100 people, I think they can fit in there. They like to have a little larger group, so they're thinking about changing that.
There's a great book by Brian and Matthew Plum on the Beekman Arms, in case you haven't seen it. History of the Beekman Arms, which is in print right now.
So the next
Brian
slide is the real loss. I have two pictures of White's Corner. It was called White's Corner because it was a white building. There wasn't a Mr. White. But it was 1816 Christian Shell built this white building that at one time or another was Mrs. Gall's Grocery, Henry Group's Furniture, First National Bank, Dr. Martin Fraley, and the post office. And it was torn down in the mid-1900s for an SL gas station, which somebody sent me a picture of, but that's not in the DAR collection. So there's one picture here with old cars, and there's the Ford dealership in there, and there's another picture of it in the collection. It was quite a magnificent building, and of course today, if we look at the next slide, it's Foster's parking lot, and there's a nice sign that says White's Corner, but that would have been a nice building to have on the corner. So the next one, of course, is the construction of the Rhinebeck department store. This was all built around 1870 after the 1867 fire burned down the whole south side of Market Street, and the Eagle Hotel, which is currently the cigar store, was built, and this was built a couple of years after that. And if we look at the slide today, it looks pretty much, well, it's built now. You have to visualize it from the bricks. It was Smiley's hardware store and an bicycle store in 1870.
And this is very round-headed windows, sort of, Italian keystones.
So I guess a lot of the buildings along Market Street were brick after the big fire, just like Three Little Pigs. Build your house of brick and it won't be blown down or burned down. So if we go to the next slide, this is the Rhinebeck Women's Exchange. And the lady on the left, we guarantee is Laura Delano. We found some other pictures of her.
Franklin D. Roosevelt's cousin, 4 years younger. She was in her early 30s at this time, 1918.
And she ran this women's exchange for women to come in with their crafts that they made at home, and I guess and sell them to make some money for the family. And this is a strange building. And today it looks pretty much the same. These sort of Greek Ionic columns.
Ionic columns with the pilasters, classical pilasters, and
So
simplified egg and dart molding in the architrave.
So it's an unusual building for
Are
Rhinebeck.
the paintings still inside?
I don't know. It just was taken over by a store that's selling paper and fresh cut flowers.
Well, the women here,
Last I knew, Huck Hill had the painting and he was storing it.
women used to bake pies and cakes during World War. down there, and sell them, you know, and people used to go in and buy them and so forth. That's why they call it Women's Exchange.
Let's look at the next slide. The Mann House. Now, this house was probably built by James Cowles, who was a merchant in Rhinebeck. Most photos identified as the Cowles House. This is from Nancy's Rhinebeck architecture book. This building is again not here. Notice the chimney, the roof, and the stone of this building before we go to the next slide. And we go to the next slide, and it's Rhinebeck Bank. So it was another beautiful building that we lost to a brick building.
And this had been the Central Hudson office, right?
It was a Central Hudson office
Before the
before it
bank
became
took
the
it.
bank took it over. So again, another building. Now, the next shot is there's two pictures here of a Chevy dealer. This was a car repair and a post office. And this was a parade. We think that these are the current cars, which would have been 1918, 1919.
Middle
Well, maybe this was a later picture. I'm not. This might not have been from the photographer, the French photographer.
And,
Go ahead.
just from the cars, it looks like it's probably mid-1930s.
These would be the modern cars parked on the street. And the next slide shows, I guess this is what went for a bicycle, and of course some antique cars. I like that little one at the end.
And boys in knickers.
And boys in knickers. So the knickers, Dawn said, makes it 1930s. That was the clothing style. Go along with it. So we went up to the second floor of the real estate office above the Liberty Tavern to try to get the same shot out the window. And of course we have Gigi's, and the post office is gone, and we now have another parking lot. But the building is still pretty much intact. It was a Ford dealership before it became a Chevy dealership. And I have some pictures of it when it was a Ford dealership, but I'm not going to show them tonight because they're not in the DAR collection. The Platt House. This is another house that we lost. Dr. Epithet Platt? Okay. It'd be easier if I had a list.
Perfect.
Dr. Platt was supposed to have been one of the few doctors in Rhinebeck in the mid-1800s, and he was elected as one of the first trustees in 1834 when the village was incorporated. And this is a beautiful building. Talk about it.
Yeah, and again, it's a side hall, 3-bay, sort of like a 2/3 Georgian house. Now, it may not have a full hall. It may be just like a vestibule, side entry into a vestibule and then a stairway.
Sort of like a Middle Eastern thing, something like
And
on the porch.
This is sort of a Turkish touch, Middle Eastern touch. The OG spandrels between columns and porch. You have to remember this is pre-air conditioning. A lot of these houses are pre-air conditioning and barely centrally heated at the time. So you'll see a lot of porches in these pictures for one thing.
Thank you for pointing out that it probably was Georgian, and then they added all this decoration on it.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as former town historian Dick Crowley said, most of these unusual porches and woodwork that were on the buildings in Rhinebeck were done by Stephen McCartys.
Did a lot of building.
Well, they had some fine carpenters. But
They did,
It was
and-
mostly hand tools too, hand saws and chisels.
And if we look at it today, the next slide, sheer cleaners, Scanlon Cleaners. I know, Scanlon Cleaners. This is a picture I took a few months ago. They've changed owners, but it's still a dry cleaner.
Yeah, the house
And
was
was
the
lost.
cleaners.
The house went to the cleaners, yes. We've lost it, so I feel bad about that one. The next one is the Dr. Cramer House. These names right. It was owned by Dr. Cross in 1858, and it's an interesting house.
And it's missing its gingerbread. It had probably scads of gingerbread on it originally. The wonderful Belmont House is right next door. It still has its gingerbread trim. The cross gable. This is Gothic Revival. which began in this country that became popular around 1840-ish and lasted up into the 1870s. And so most of these peaks have the gingerbread trim, verge boards with gingerbread cutout trim. And it's board and batten. And of course, Andrew Jackson Downey was the great promoter of this style of architecture. And his house was done in Carpenter Gothic and Newburgh.
Look at the next slide, we'll see what it looks like today. And it's not too bad, it's not too much different.
Lightning splitter roof.
And it's of course part of the inn today. And the next slide is Old Tammany Hall, which was a tavern and a meeting hall, I guess, is that what, where the villagers hold meetings and stuff. And it's a nice little building.
And the story is that Aaron Burr made this his headquarters during his campaign for the presidency in the early 1800s, and there's no documentary evidence to that effect. So it's probably a myth, and I know Brian Plum has done a lot of research into that, and I've done some research into it, and I've never seen Rhinebeck attached to Aaron Burr's name in any of the works I've consulted, so.
More legends.
What street is that?
That's on Route 9, and you'll see
Oh,
another beautiful
Right across from the
restoration.
school.
You know,
Ruby's
Rugies, another building that we've lost. It's now Rugies Subaru. They try to make it a village-looking building, not a, glass order store, so it's kind of tastefully done, but still it's not the building that we lost, unfortunately. The next one's pretty much the same Fireman's Hall as the Pocahontas. It's a brick building, which a firehouse should be, I guess. And
1870s.
yeah, and it looks pretty much the same. You can see the bay of the firehouse. This two bays have been closed in a little bit for the other store and the chocolate stores there. But at least the building is still there.
Belltower's gone.
And the Pocahontas is still with us. Vern Sibley keeps it polished. And it's always in the Memorial Day Parade next month. Now I got a couple of slides here of this is Fraley's Livery. This is of course Garden Street, down here to the health food store, the Market Street restaurant. And this is a beautiful old wooden building.
Again, a Georgian plan house with a salt box off the back. Green food.
There's another picture of it. Livery, and 100 years ago, 150 years ago, Rhinebeck was all about horses. There were stables, there were tack shops and blacksmiths, and when you look at that 1867 map, half the businesses in the village of Rhinebeck were all about horses. And this is, again, a nice building.
You notice the sash, the 12 over 12 light sashes, English style double hung sash windows.
And there was a veterinarian, I don't know if you can read the sign, but the sign above the Fraley Brothers
Oh, yeah,
reads.
veterinarian up
Yeah,
there.
it's a veterinarian.
So it was all about horses. And that was torn down, and this is Len Tremper in front of his Ford dealership. It's a stone building that was built after the wooden building was torn down. And today, of course, it's the bagel shop on the corner.
Dutch colonial revival.
To try to look like the post office, sort of, but it's a bagel store. It's not a post office. Now, the next slide is Dr. Hans Kierstead Herman's house, and Dr. Hans Kierstead built the house around 1793. He was, again, one of the first doctors in Rhinebeck. His daughter, Sally, married Martin Hermans in 1789, which is why it has this double name. And it's been under restoration for 10 years or more. And if you look at the next slide, whoops.
Sorry.
And it's an Adams style, again, Georgian central hall, 5 bays, 2 stories deep, and then major additions were made, including a Second Empire Tower, probably in the 1870-ish, 80. And we don't know about the structure of the wing on the north, on the right side. If that might have been an earlier house, and
They added the big house
the
to
large
it.
house was attached to it.
So the next slide, the slide says it's the Buccioni candy store, but the store's vacant, but it is the hardware store, the Rosenkrantz hardware store on the left. Now Don and I were walking up and down East Market Street, so okay, where is this building? It must be one of these buildings. We walked and walked, and once again, we couldn't find it. And the key to seeing this location is, look at the siding on this building. There's 2 windows here, and there's another window up here behind the trees. Remember that. And now, once again, we have a 1923 Sanborn map. And this was the year where they renumbered East Market Street. These are the old numbers, 5, 7, 13, 21. And the new numbers have, more numbers on them along the way. And if you look at the current addresses, 41 East Market is the liquor store. 25 East Market is Hummingbird Jewelry. These buildings here, including the hardware store, the candy store, are now, turn the page. And notice, here's the siding, the 2 windows, and the window up there. This was the side of the liquor store. So all those buildings, once again, were lost to us for a parking lot. So we go to the next slide. Now this one looks pretty much the same. This was the shared house at 55 East Market Street, built around 1795. Nicholas Drury, a barber, lived there in 1867. Jacob Shadd lived there in 1876 and owned a stable to the west side of the building, which means that I'm not sure if that was the stable or if Ariel's was the stable, or if Ariel's was a building that replaced the stable. But it says that was the building to the west of it,
And
or
this,
east of it.
this is survival,
West, yes.
survival of the 1864 fire.
That's the Thai restaurant.
Right.
You're right.
See, it hasn't changed much.
It's a story and a half building, which is the framing is Dutch framing, H-bent framing, anchor beam framing. And that's why it's a story and a half and not one story. And it has a cross gable, and again, the cross gables became very popular with the Gothic revival craze beginning in 1840. And this had a central hall, 5 bays, and 2 rooms deep, with a lean-to off the back.
And of course, today, I try to get a picture without cars, but there's always cars parked in front of it. I came by many times, and there's always cars parked in front of the building. But it looks, except a little bit, the columns on the porch changed, but it looks pretty much the same as it did. That's now the Thai restaurant. We have the next slide. There's another house that looks pretty much the same. The Riley House. This was the location of the original Methodist church before it was built around the corner. And then that Methodist church burned down in 1898, and was rebuilt a year later after it burned down. And so if we look at it today, it looks pretty much the same as it did. Just a pretty simple frame house. Now, the next slide, we move on to Livingston Street. This was the Third Lutheran Church. It was built in 1842 and badly burned in a fire in 1909 in front of the church, which is why the 2 pictures look so different. Stephen McCartys, again, probably built this church. And if you look at the building and the big steeple and the columns in the front.
There are columns in front.
And if we took the next slide today, they, I guess, rebuilt what was not too badly damaged in the fire, but they didn't rebuild the whole front of the church with the big columns. So it's a lot smaller than it was before the fire in 1842. All right, a couple of more houses. The John O'Brien House, built in 1875, was the first house in the village to use gas lighting. It was built by Mrs. O'Brien's father, Albert Ryder, as a wedding gift. Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Ryder were in the construction business, and they helped build the Rhinebeck, Connecticut Railroad as one of their projects. And this house has just been restored, and
It's a Second Empire house. Usually use the term Second Empire. It's a French, when Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew became president of France, he did some major work on the city in Paris, and did a lot of urban renewal or removal, depending on how you want to look at it. Created the boulevards of Paris, and this became a very popular house style after the Civil War. Beginning before the Civil War, but mostly after the Civil War, so 1870s and 80s. This house had brick nogging in all its exterior walls, which were recently removed. The bricks were removed, and it was space-age insulation was put in between the studding of the house. It's a very impressive house, and now in really good condition, really technically brought up to date, I guess. But
The next house is the DAR House, which was built in 1773 and is the oldest frame house in the village. It was originally the house of General Montgomery. He lived there until he was killed in Quebec in December of 1775. He was the first American general killed in the war, and it was moved in 1864 from Route 9 to its current location, and some alterations were made. The Victorian front peak was removed, as you'll see in the current slide. Which was it? And of course, this is the home of the DAR. It's where their archives and their meetings are.
And again, a story and a half, Dutch framed anchor bent. The bents are the trusses for each bay in the house. This would be, again, 5 bays with a central entry. They probably had a vestibule rather than a full central hall. And after the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, we went back to, started to go back to this country, became enamored with the colonial revival. So a lot of Victorian houses were looked on as being out of fashion, an old hat, and so people started fixing their houses up to make them look more colonial, or building replica colonial houses, colonial revival houses. And a number of the houses had their cross gables taken off so they would look earlier. So it's, again, another movement in fashion as far as house design went.
We have a few more houses outside the village to finish up the photograph part. This is the Maples. We just got a donation from Kay Verrilli of the Astor collection, and in there, which we haven't gotten to yet, Nancy had showed me a little bit of it a year or so ago, there are original drawings for it. And when I looked at the Maples, I said, this doesn't have these 2 wings. And the drawings that Nancy showed me, which are in that room, and we'll get to them eventually, showed a billiard room and a library on each side of the Maples. And they were taken off. And this was originally a boarding house where Tommy Thompson stayed. It was converted for a guest house for Astor's friends driving up from New York City to Albany. And if we look at the current picture, the wings are gone. It's still in pretty nice shape, well taken care of, but somebody took off the billiard room and the library, and of course they've added a handicap ramp because it's a doctor's office.
Notice the French-style casement windows in the main facade. Very fashionable back then.
Next slide is the Tommy O'Brien Benner House at 77 Mill Street, built around 1730, right out on Route 9. It was used as the first Methodist meetings held by Freeborn Garrettson in 1791. 19th century used as Dr. Walter Landon's writing school, and later occupied by Civil War soldier Thomas O'Brien. And
this is a very important house. It's one of the earliest surviving houses in the town. It measures 23 feet across the front and 20 feet to the back. So it's actually a stone cabin, a single cell dwelling. It has a full cellar. There's evidence that it had a jamless smoke hood fireplace in it originally. 2 families lived in this house. An addition was put on only in the 1940s, a frame addition on the north was added in the 1940s. So they had a family living in the cellar and the family living on the first floor. And I don't know what they did with the garret, but there's a stairway that goes up to the garret that is no more than 20 inches wide in this corner to the right of the door. It's an amazing house. Well, you know, when you look at these early houses, the ones that have survived, you have to, you know, it reminds me of the old Volkswagen they had. Think small, because they were very small houses, very mean, small houses. And the two Kip houses, the Abraham Kip and the Jacob Kip houses were like this also. Initially, and they were added to later, but the initial houses were very small, stone houses. Cabins or hall and parlor houses.
Today it's
The cellar
beautifully restored.
entrance is over here. And this may have been built up some too. There's a cistern.
Right.
There's a cistern here, and this little structure here is a crank water pump. Yeah, we blew it up. And there's a base here, probably bluestone base, a sink. And the spout is right there, that little cross dark spot there. But you can see the crank up here. And so it's quite an elaborate pump, probably with a chain with cups on it between the. And I've looked down into the cistern is still there, over here, just beyond the stone, the original stone corner. There's a 7-foot deep cistern, about, I guess about 3.5 feet in diameter, 40 inches in diameter. Catch water. It was dry when I looked down there, but that's where the pump was to bring the water up out of the well. No indoor plumbing, and they probably had an outhouse in the back too.
The next house is Trevor House on Wine Coop, built around Wine Coop, sorry. Built around 1730, believed to be the home of Bastian Trevor, son of Anna Maria Hoffman Trevor, who was one of the original Palatine families who arrived in 1710.
Okay. Again, I don't have the measurement of this house, but it's no more than the original house. This block back here. This is out later. I mean, I don't know how much later. It's built into the embankment, and that was a very sure sign that it was a Germanic house, a Palatine house, for one thing. They always look for a slope to build into. So it probably had the kitchen in the cellar, and then a room upstairs, stewed upstairs. This house, eyeballing it from the road, it looks like it's about maybe 20, on a square, maybe 24 feet by 22 feet or something like that. The gables are usually wider. As you see also in Dutch barns, the gables are wider than the depth of the buildings. But the kitchen was very important, and it was, if you can imagine the heat that was built up cooking, especially on hot July days in the basement. So they had ventilation, and it helped in the winter too, because there was no central heating. Or, like I said, there were fireplaces. And the Germans were great for using cast iron stoves off of the main flue. Yeah, here's this is a modern picture of it. So there's an entrance here, and then there's an entrance around the corner, up the slope, in this gable end, which is the west gable.
It's been beautifully maintained. There's a new roof on it. Looks good. It's nice there's so many houses we've seen lost along the journey
And
tonight.
this house is pretty much contemporaneous with the Benner House here in the village, about 1830-ish.
Next is Mools Tavern, which is at the intersection of 9 and 9G. It was built prior to it's on a 1798 map, so it was built before that.
By the 9G light.
Yeah, and it was the center of old Rhinebeck because the Palatines were up that way towards the Palatine farmstead. People could eat, drink, and sleep there. Early town meetings were held in the building. It's been called Way's Corner, Pink's Corner, and of course was a stop on the Rhinebeck, Connecticut Railroad. And today, it's still there.
And again, it's a central, 5-bay central entrance, and a nice Palladian style window above the entranceway.
You have to drive out of town,
Sure.
past the Gulf Station, and then make your first left turn. You'll go up this little tiny street until you come out again on 9G. And it's hidden in there. It's really well maintained,
And
which is nice.
And there's this, you can just see it here in this garage. This is an early sash they reused in the garage, or carriage house, or whatever it was before it became a garage. You can see looks like it's 12 over
12 over
8 or
12.
something like that. It's still there. That window's still in the garage.
And the last house is Equipment House, built in 1798 as a parsonage for Stone Church and served as the residence of Reverend Frederick Quitman until 1829. Of course, now it's Equipment Resource Center for Preservation and the home of the Rhinebeck Museum of History. And it looks pretty much the same today. It's been beautifully restored. Don was one of the people who restored it.
Well, no, I'm sure. These faux keystones over the windows, the Marilyn Hatch had one of those surviving from the original decor in the house. And you can see they're not, oh, there is one there.
There is one, yes.
But the others are missing.
Yeah, the others are gone.
And so she had about a half-inch thick, and it was in pretty rough shape. So I used that as a pattern, and then I made pine faux keystones for the first floor windows and installed them with brass screws back in around 1994, I think, something like that. I also replaced these two windows, which were rotted, the frames were rotted out, and adapted sash to fit them, these two, and then there was another one around the corner that was rotted. But again, it's a central hall, 5-bay facade, and by the way, these aren't eyebrow windows. They're frieze windows. Frieze windows, and again, it's a story and a half. Dutch framing, anchor vents between bays, trusses, anchor beams, which are the horizontal beams, and two posts in an H shape, so that it's called the H vents. Framing, Dutch framing.
So these are just 30 of the several hundred pictures that I scanned that are available on the web now. I want to show you a couple of examples of some of the other documents that we got. Here's like an indenture from 1718 between Henry Beekman and John and Katharina Rutson and John Backus, and it talks about the sale and the location of the property. On the next slide, at the bottom, you can see Henry Beekman and the other signers, Cornelia Livingston, and so we have there's many dozen deeds to various indentures and deeds and property sales in the collection. Another example is here's another, the appointment of Captain James Van Curd on 111th Regiment, and it's signed by, witnessed by DeWitt Clinton, Governor, Esquire, Governor of said state and General Commander-in-Chief of the Militia. So there's wonderful documents in here. And if we look at the next one, it's hard to read this, but this is a list of the 20th Regiment Militia, all the people that are in it. It's a really large document, and you can read it if you zoom in on it on your computer. You can read some of the names.
Is that from the Civil War?
Yes. And the next slide is these are prints. These were very large. I had to scan them in two pieces and sort of glue them together in Photoshop. At some point, I'm going to try to clean that up a little bit and get rid of the line. This is a beautiful print. It's really large. It's about this big. The Parade of the Grand Army of the Republic in September 20th, 1892. It's amazing the color and how vivid they are. They're in the archive room. And there's another one, a really sad one, a bird's eye view of the Andersonville prison. And when you zoom on it, you can see all the soldiers. and the horrid living conditions with that one stream, actually sort of cesspool that ran through the prison, and the horrible conditions that were under. Fort McHenry, Baltimore is another nice print. Little pieces was lost through it. Here's the Francis Scott Key Memorial Association. Theo Delaporte from Rhinecliff, New York, was appointed from Rhinebeck, New York. Is that Cliff? Or? This is Beck. Was appointed to the Francis Scott Key. Mrs. Delaporte was a very important person 100 years ago in the DAR, and she documented a lot of activities that happened. We have a lot of journals in the back cabinets there that describe what went on in Rhinebeck during the time. She was very, very important to the history of Rhinebeck. And the next slide, I'm going to end the slides with, this doesn't do justice how beautiful this is, picture of the general. Now, I want to show you how to get to this stuff. If you look at it, go to rhinebeckhistory.org, which is all the consortium of Rhinebeck history. And then there's Rhinebeck Historical Society Archives. You click on that, and up comes our web page, which talks about us. And then the Archives of the Rhinebeck Historical Society is right here. If you click on that, you can do a search. And what we did was, it's a giant collection with a lot of stuff in it. So we wanted to be able to either come at it from two directions. That if you said, I want to look for a picture of the Beekman Arms, you might find a dozen of them all throughout our archives. But there were two of them in the DAR collection. So what we did was, we put in front of every one of these 600 entries in the collection, CLC-DAR. If you type that in, then the entire 600 item collection comes up, separate from the archives. So you can come in either way by looking for something, a picture of White's Corner or a picture of a Dutch Reformed church, and you'll find many copies of it throughout the collection. But you can just go CLC-DAR and the whole collection comes up. And here's a sample of it. And we added something new to our system a couple of months ago, a media link. And if it's blue, you can click on it. Like this one says, a print of Camp Belger, Baltimore shows the housing of the 150 Regiment volunteers. And if you click on the blue link, you get the 150th Regiment encamped at Camp Belger. So you can go through the collection, and there's about 20 large books that I haven't scanned yet. But all the documents, the photographs, the prints are scanned, and there's over 500 of them. You can look at them at your leisure and look through them. And that's our show.